I'm delighted to welcome Paul Spires to the You and Your Business studio. Hiya, Paul.
Hello, Alec. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yeah, fantastic. Great to meet you. My goodness, there's a lot to cover here, and I'm looking forward to it. However, I'm afraid I'm going to just take you back a bit in your life. That last year in school, were you the person who was going to head out for fun? Were you the academic? Were you the person who wanted to travel? Tell me about that.
I was an aspiring academic, but more than an academic. I was, in reality, someone who was too keen on surfing to be spending too much time at school. So I had a conflict between my brain and my heart at that point, and the heart won.
Yes, so that's fantastic. And tell me about this in terms of, you obviously weren't surfing where you're living now.
No, I come from Aotearoa, New Zealand originally, from a small town just outside Wellington at the bottom of the North Island. And I came to the UK, where I reside now. I have done for 22 years. I arrived here in the year 2000.
So I'm gathering you didn't come there for the surfing.
No, there's amazing surf here and quite incredible surf in Ireland as well.
There certainly is, if you've got the tough skin to manage the weather.
Yeah.
All right, so surfing is great. It's not going to provide a living. So tell me, how are you supporting yourself?
So I left school at 16, and I initially started work in a photography lab as a photographer's assistant. I've always had, right up to this point in time, a passion for creativity, and it started there as well. And then I worked part-time as well as a musician, semi-professional musician, touring New Zealand, playing music for 5 or 6 years.
That must have been quite interesting. I mean, two totally separate careers. I mean, both obviously in the public eye. And let's just talk about what you learned about being a musician on the road. I mean, there must have been handling people, managers, venues, and all that goes with that.
Yeah, it's tenacity more than anything else, I think, is the life on the road. Whatever you are, whether you're a incredibly famous musician touring the world, or whether you're doing the hard yards in your local town or your local country as well. I think tenacity and the building relationships with people is absolutely critical, and then finding that time to continue to harness and feed the very thing that creates music, the creativity, writing the songs and writing the music, and that's the balancing act, I guess.
And I suppose you would have also, it's a very sort of busy space, so there's a lot of challenge of getting your voice heard, if you would excuse the pun.
There is, and you've got to. I guess that's my first. As we'll come on to later on, no doubt. I moved into branding and marketing many years later, but that was my first exposure to how you market yourself as a band and how you create your unique position in that market, whether it's via music or via image or the posters and the graphics and so on that you design. So it was a very good early introduction to the power of marketing, I guess, and the power of creating a brand around you or the image around you.
Yes, I know, that's fantastic. So you came to a crossroads, and that crossroads was saying it's going to be music or it's going to be something else.
Yeah, well, I was, I guess around 22, I woke up to stop deluding myself that I was going to be a rock star like many of us do. And I took myself off to university and studied criminology for 4 years, and went to postgraduate in criminology. It was something I'd always been interested in as well. I'm a sponge for knowledge and information, and I was fascinated by subcultures, and we'd played with a lot of gangs when we were in the music business, playing for festivals and that sort of thing. So
all right,
it was an area that I wanted to explore in more detail.
I'd say through those studies, you started recognizing people you were associating with in the past. I don't mean in any sort of a nefarious way, but it must have been interesting to start analyzing some of the people that you met.
Yeah, well, I think what was fascinating, what I learned through my experience in the band and also through criminology as well, is there are many incredible entrepreneurs. Just not everyone has the same opportunity to explore that entrepreneurship in a commercial sense. So I think that's part of the passion with the new P&L as well, is to try and open more doors to more people to explore their entrepreneurship and to explore their commercial ability. There's an awful lot of creativity and business acumen that goes amiss because some people don't have the doors open to them in the same way that others do.
I think just for our audience sake, you might explain P&L is not in the sense that they might be thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. So the new P&L, the new P&L Brand Purpose Institute, and the new P&L Principles in Leadership and Business podcast, it is, as I've just suggested, it is a new P&L based on principles and leadership, not just profit and loss.
Yeah, and I think that's important for people just to remember, because people associate it, as you said, with profit and loss. So with this degree in criminality, and where are you heading? Or criminology, I should say. Criminality. Criminology. I think there's something a bit different there. We get us both arrested for that.
Yeah, exactly.
So for criminology, so you were going to take that somewhere, or were you?
Yeah, no, I was planning to pursue an academic career at that point. While I was at university, I was introduced to the world of marketing and advertising and PR and so on by a friend, and I didn't really know that industry existed to the degree that it did. I'd come from a working class family with tradesmen in the family, so it was a very different world to me. But I landed a job in marketing when I came out of the university world, and I was there for the next 20 odd years, I guess.
What attracted you initially to it? I mean, so you see it, and you mentioned about you have a natural curiosity, but going in there, talk about sort of your phases of going through that and where you started refining your interest in that whole sector.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I went into it because it just seemed to be a natural trajectory in terms of my desire to have creativity at the heart of my professional and personal growth. Right back to when I was a kid, writing stories, or the photographic studio, or the music, or the desire for knowledge and information. Everything comes back to curiosity and creativity. And it seemed that marketing gave me that opportunity. So I started with, as a typical content developer, writing thought leadership pieces and press releases and so on, and then moved, as you do, moved through into sort of senior management and leadership positions in other agencies, and then started to establish my own, first in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and then a couple over here as well in the UK.
In terms of writing articles and things like that, was English a strong subject for you in school, or is this something that you acquired as you progressed through your career?
Probably a bit of both. Storytelling was probably a strong subject for me, but like anything, you're on a constant growth curve, aren't you? And the more you do it, the more you learn, and the more you read, and the more you apply some of what you've read and what you've learned into your own writing. So I think I was reasonably strong, but when I look back at what I was writing then, 25 years ago, whatever it happens to be, it seems quite primitive in comparison to what I'm writing now, but that's the learning curve.
You identified something quite early on there in terms of storytelling, and we hear it more and more about authenticity and storytelling. And take us on that journey a bit about the importance of it in terms of communications.
I mean, if you can't tell an authentic story, particularly today with the advent of social media and a much more cynical consumer, a much more transparent world, if you can't be honest and authentic about the story you're telling, then you don't sell product the way you used to. The balance of power has shifted between brand and consumer. 20, 30, 40 years ago, the brand would decide what the consumer received. The brand would decide when the consumer received it, and the brand would have the power to develop the new product, and that was the only option. Now the consumer has the power, and the consumer can review, officially or unofficially. The consumer can tweet or post or whatever they want to do about the brand and about their perceptions of the brand. So the brand has had to become far more honest and authentic and transparent about who they are, why they exist, and what they're trying to deliver to the consumer or the customer.
And if you're just joining me now, if you're listening to me, Alec Drew, on 103.2 Dublin City FM, where my studio guest is Paul Spires. And we were just talking about storytelling, authenticity, and the importance of brand. As you said, the power of balance has shifted more towards the consumer. I suppose many entrepreneurs out there struggle to find stories, but tell them where they'll find them.
They find them in their hearts. They find them within themselves. Every entrepreneur started a business for a reason. They started with a purpose. And I think far too often, and probably, marketeers are guilty of this, far too often marketeers maybe try to create the veneer of a narrative or a story, whereas in fact the real story is within the entrepreneur or the business themselves. Why were they established? What are they trying to achieve? What is the impact they want to make on the world? What is the emotional relationship they want to have with the consumer? I think all of these things need to be built into the story. So I think if they're looking externally for the story, it's probably the wrong place. The real story exists within the hearts and the minds of that entrepreneur themselves. They know why they established the business. They know what they were trying to achieve. They know what the relationship is and the impact is that they want to have with their world and with society.
And do you think it would be fair to say that probably most entrepreneurs underestimate the value of their own stories?
Yes, because I think there's an enormous leaning towards imposter syndrome. And if you have imposter syndrome, then you don't really believe in the value or the strength of the story you have to tell. Whereas, that is the most important story any entrepreneur has. And if we can get over that imposter syndrome, I had a guest on the new P&L podcast last year called Dove
Right.
Barron, and he's a global leadership expert. And he said he's always had imposter syndrome, but what he did is he turned it 180 degrees. So he uses his imposter syndrome as a belief that if he's feeling imposter syndrome, if he's feeling anxiety about it, that means he's trying to grow, he's trying to do better, he's trying to be better. So we can turn this imposter syndrome to our benefit rather than seeing it as a fear or a detriment to us.
I think that's an important aspect for people to consider. I think we all go through the imposter syndrome feeling at some stage in our lives.
We do, absolutely, absolutely. And I don't think, it continues to creep up on us all of the time. I don't think anyone, however far you get in business, completely eradicates imposter syndrome. And in some ways, it's a very positive thing because it keeps you on the edge, it keeps you wanting, it keeps you growing. Complacency is far more dangerous than imposter syndrome.
A lot of, again, businesses, not just starting off, but even established businesses find it difficult to understand that you require some sort of budget to invest in marketing and branding. Perhaps you might suggest to some of our listeners where to start with that. I mean, you have a wealth of experience over the years.
You absolutely need a budget. I think far too often we throw that budget at the wrong things because we look at the tactic, not the strategy. So it isn't about the channel first and foremost. It's about what you are trying to achieve with that marketing budget. I think the other side of it is we don't align our expectations. So whether you're working with an external agency or with an internal marketeer, the MD, the entrepreneur, the CEO, and that marketeer or that agency have to set their shared expectations of what can be practically and honestly delivered from the budget that you've allocated. I think far too often that conversation isn't had. The CEO or the entrepreneur expects this from that delivery, and the marketeer knows that they can only deliver that. I don't think any of these things are necessarily rocket science. A lot of it comes down to communication and having a shared understanding of what's possible and what is expected.
So you often find in these situations people separated by a common language.
Absolutely, absolutely. As Oscar Wilde said, yes.
Yeah, exactly. You put the quotation, that's not mine, and I wouldn't claim it. Again, talking about your own business journey, you arrived in the UK and you set up your own agency, but everything's not plain sailing as we all discover in business. Maybe you might take us through just a couple of transitions you might have had along the road there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the idea of the new P&L itself, principles and leadership, came from the disintegration of one of the marketing agencies I ran. We were subject at the time to a series of very unethical actions that took the agency to its knees.
Wow.
At that time, being a creative at heart, I came up with the idea of the new P&L, principles and leadership, because there had to be a better way of doing business than that which we were subjected to. And I guess one of the things I learned out of that is if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have come up with a new P&L. If I hadn't come up with a new P&L, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now, which I believe to be the thing that is the most synergist with anything I've ever done in my professional life. I believe with the podcast and with the Institute, I'm doing what I've been called to do without being too evangelical about it. I believe I'm on a mission to create a more principled leadership and more purpose-led business, but none of that would have come had I not felt the pain of the agency and what happened to us. So the best advice is, if you're not dead, it's not over. There's always opportunity.
I like that. And I think most entrepreneurs will associate with the pain of going through various transitions in their life. And I think you must come out of it stronger. You if you don't survive it, you're probably should be going to work for somebody else.
Yeah, and it does take a special kind of resilience, I think, to be an entrepreneur of whatever queue that happens to be, whether you're a corner shop owner or a huge multi-million-pound tech business. I think it takes a particular type of tenacity to know that you are responsible at the end of the day for your and many other people's salaries, for the vision of that business and the growth of that business. But, we've got to learn from the challenges we have. We've got to always believe that tomorrow will be better than today. That's the fundamental ethos of an entrepreneur, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's a very good one. And I don't think it's a mistake if you actually learn something of value from it.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So doing it yourself and coming out of some sort of more challenging times in your life, tell us more about the business that you set up. You've already given us some hints about it, but how did you sort of formulate it? And again, I think you've been what we call a solopreneur in the sense of you didn't go into partnership.
Yes. So as I said, the new P&L Principles and Leadership, the idea came out of that challenge in my agency. I hung on to that idea for probably 5 years. I knew it was a strong idea, but I couldn't find at that point the right vehicle for it. I didn't know how to deliver that idea into the market. And then about 2.5 years ago, the idea of a podcast and the idea of the new P&L came together. And I thought, well, perhaps I launch a podcast, speak to business leaders from around the world, solicit their ideas on principled leadership, on purpose and business, and all of those other things that sit around leadership. And it seemed to take off. We're 176 episodes in, we're 2.5 years in. We are listened to in over 80 countries, top 5% globally in terms of listens and downloads.
Wow.
And thousands of business leaders and entrepreneurs listen to us. And, that goes back to my point that came from the ashes. This idea came from the ashes of an agency crashing. Yet it is the best thing I've ever done in my life. In my early 50s, I've finally found what I'm supposed to be doing. But I could still be in that agency, still building it, still growing it, but not having found my calling.
And if you're just joining us now, you're listening to me, Alec Drew, on 103.2 Dublin City FM, where my studio guest today is Paul Spires. Let's talk further about finding yourself, if we can call it that. The genesis of it, you said it was kind of kicking around in the back of your mind for some time. How did you then start finding a way to deliver it?
Look, I can draw a direct line from when I was 7 years old. I won an encyclopedia in a raffle, and we didn't have any books in the house, or very few books in the house. And Mum said for the next 2 years, I devoured that encyclopedia of the world. I was just glued to it. And I can draw a direct line from that 7-year-old boy to me in my early 50s. And so I knew when the new P&L idea came about, I knew that it would solve my quest for knowledge, solve my desire for being an information sponge, solve my drive and my passion to create more principled leadership and purpose-led business. So I knew somewhere the answer would come to me. I just had to be very, very intent and intensive about listening to people, listening to what they said, trying to solicit ideas from them about how I could create this vehicle. And the idea for the podcast came from a casual conversation I had with a friend. But you can't just take the idea and think, well, it's a nice idea. You have to action it, as you know yourself.
Yes.
So my commitment to the podcast was, if I was to launch it, unlike lots of creatives who have great ideas, and I'm guilty for the last 48 years, coming up with great ideas, starting them off, and then 3 weeks later they're dead. But I said, if I start this, I've got to run it, and I've got to run it every week, and I've got to keep it going, and this is going to be it for me. So the commitment and the intensity and the action is the key to the success of the new P&L. But the idea, I can draw a direct line from that 7-year-old boy to that 50-year-old man launching this podcast.
And really what you've just demonstrated very nicely, which is part of the earlier piece of the conversation, was about an authentic story and how something is created from that will resonate with people. In terms of podcasts, obviously you had to find your niche in that marketplace and identify people you wanted to speak with and then contact them. There's a lot of work behind that. Tell us a bit about your approach to it.
Yeah, I mean, I promised myself from the beginning that I would never waste anyone's time or my time. So for each podcast I do, each interview, because we've got two variations in the episodes, but for each interview I think an awful lot and do an awful lot of research in advance about the topic I want to look at, the people who are specialists in that area, and then I spend an awful lot of time researching and developing the questions, because for me, our USP was going to be the quality and the depth of the discussion that we have with those guests, that it wouldn't be just another what's your favorite color and what's your favorite whatever it happens to be. I really wanted to get to the nuts and the bolts of what they were trying to achieve and what their views were on leadership and purpose and principles, because that's the whole ethos and the ethics of the business. So if I couldn't deliver that, then what's the point of me calling it the new P&L? I may as well just call it leadership or call it another benign name, that didn't really mean anything. So I had to commit to the quality of it. It takes an inordinate amount of time to do it sometimes.
Sure.
And sometimes it can be frustrating and you're just thinking, maybe I should have come up with a celebrity podcast. That might have been easier. But
yes.
But I love it because I'm, every day I'm learning. My wife and my children, every time I come off the conversations with these leaders or these entrepreneurs, I say, wow, that was an amazing person. And I start telling them everything that this person's told me. I mean, they're, after 2.5 years, my family is very tired of this conversation each week, but I love it. I'm learning. I'm being paid to do the best job in the world as far as I'm concerned right at the moment.
In terms of approaching these various people, what are the biggest challenges around that?
I guess it's identifying them, then finding out how to get in contact with them. Sometimes, again, it comes back to the tenacity and the persistence. But again, if I've done my research right and my pitch to them is right and it's deep enough and thoughtful enough from the outset, then, more often than not, most of them will engage with me and have that conversation. What we're fortunate about now is because of the extent, I guess, and the amplification and the reach, we get a lot of people coming to us,
Sure.
which helps to manage that as well. But it is really just doing your homework first, not making it look like you've just approached them because they happen to pop up on LinkedIn or they happen to, you happen to know who they are because they're a prominent business person. Actually doing the hard work, doing the hard yards first and thinking about it.
You certainly need passion for that. But there's the other side of that part of the business, is which now you've got the people, you've now had the podcast, but now you have to get it out to an audience.
Mm-hmm.
It does that come on the back of their popularity or notoriety, or how much work have you to put in to make sure it gets out to the audience?
Yeah, I mean, it's both. Obviously, the wider the network the guest has, the wider ultimately this podcast is going to spread, because we also utilize their network through their promotion of their episode. But we do an awful lot of work ourselves through predominantly LinkedIn, through our community that we're building, month on month, through our newsletter, through the other promotions that we do. We still have a long way to go in terms of continuing to extend it, but the relationship that we develop with most of our guests means that whatever we do is amplified 100% by them as well, because they're promoting it out to their network. But in order to do that, you've got to provide them, and as you know yourself, with all of the assets,
Sure.
the marketing assets, make life as easy as you can for them to promote your product.
In terms of the technology side of all of this, was this something you had a passion for as well, or did you decide, okay, I'm going to delegate this to people who have more experience around that?
If I showed you, I should have taken a photograph of it at the time, but if I showed you the setup I had for the first few podcasts, it was a real tribute to the saying that, start now and get it right later, because it was tape holding these things up and masking tape holding something else up, and it was a real cowboys kind of setup. But I've learned as I've gone along. I've also learned what to do and what not to do. I have a professional producer and videographer. I hand over all the audio to them. They produce the audio, the video when it's required. They produce the graphics and they give it back to me. So I do the content stuff, the research stuff, the questions, I do the interview. But this person has been with me. He was actually my creative director in the agency years and years ago.
All right.
He knows his stuff, and the investment in him is totally worth it. And I have a small team around me, a VA, a content developer as well. Just those people who can do that job to enable me to do mine.
I suppose in the sort of minute and a half we've left, maybe you'll tell people how to follow you, how to contact you, and I suppose what's in it for them if they do.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can go to principlesandleadership.com. That's the website. Or you can email me at paul@principlesandleadership.com. The podcast is on the website as well, or you can find it, the new P&L, Principles and Leadership in Business, on all of your streaming platforms, Apple, Spotify, Podchaser, whatever you happen to use, Google Podcasts. What is in it for them? If you're an entrepreneur and a business person, there is a wealth of business information, easily accessible business information, either with the guests that we interview or with the new P&L to the points on a Friday, which is our weekly 10-minute analysis, if you like, of one or two of those key points. So what is in it for them is knowledge about how they can build their business, how they can grow their leadership, how they can re-embed purpose at the heart of their business.
And if you were to look at a typical audience around this, is this for everybody in business, or is there a particular area of business that you think people would benefit more from?
No, I think it's for everyone in business. I mean, everyone, we see traditional leaders as those at the top of a business. Everyone in business is a leader in their own way, in their own department, in their own job. So anyone who is in leadership at any capacity in business will benefit from this, and anyone who's trying to understand how they re-engage purpose in their business, how they re-engage their values and their principles.